thank you so much for having me, and most importantly, thank you for the coffee. I don't usually exist during these hours, so if I'm yawning a couple times, just please excuse me. Yeah, but I'll try not to. So I would like to ask you a couple of things, and feel free to participate, and if you don't want to participate, that's fine too. Who here has lost an important person in their lives? Okay, that's great. I mean, it's not great, but guess what? It's going to happen. Because, oops. Oh, yeah, that's the brilliant title of my talk, Creative Morning. I thought that no one else would have thought of that. I'm sure every other speaker in this series is probably using it. But spoiler, everyone dies. Most of us will experience a significant loss in our lifetime. Some of us might not experience birth. We'll all die, and if we live long enough, we will all lose someone that means a lot to us. And when you're a creative person, whether that means writing, art, photography, design, or even just gardening, cooking, anything that you put out in the world can serve as a way to process your grief and death. And that is a very well-known, or has been a well-known concept throughout history. Artists and photographers in the past have depicted grief and death and have tried to think about it, conceptualize it. One of these ideas can be encapsulated in memento mori art, which really means remember you must die, or remember you will die. And that can take many forms. Usually features a skull or something dying or withering away in a lovely, poetic way, like flowers wilting, or just a plate of food half-eaten. Basically little ideas like that that make you think about the impermanence of life. A lot of these ideas were also tied in with religion, of course. Most of these are from the 16th century. Same here. Along with the idea that you must prepare for death and you must try to die well, there is also the idea of the good death. What is a good death? In some cultures or some different eras in history or some professions, good death means dying in the battlefield, defending your country or your loved ones and having a heroic death. For most civilians, good death means dying at home, dying with your loved ones, dying in a comfortable, painless way. These days, even though if you were to ask anyone how would they like to die, most people will say, I want to die at home, I want to die in my sleep, I don't want to feel anything, I don't want to suffer. But unfortunately, in our time, the medicalization of the process of dying can make that difficult. You may end up dying in a hospital. And that can be problematic because doctors and medical professionals have a different drive, and that is to get you to stay alive, which is fantastic if you have a chance to stay alive, live a good life or live in a capacity that you would want. But in many cases, you cannot really do that. So people are going through difficult procedures, painful procedures, unnecessarily. Thankfully, thanks to a number of different people, like Ernest Becker in the 70s, and now Caitlin Doughty, you may have heard of her. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is one of her books. There has been a change. There has been kind of a turning of the wheel in terms of how we view death and how we approach it. And a lot of that is by being death positive. What does that mean? That means accepting that you're going to have to die. I mean, it happens. It sucks, generally. I mean, I would love to live forever, but it's not going to happen, as far as I know. You never know. So I think things are looking up in the realm of death for us. And my specific focus in life and this talk is how can we process art and how can we use art making to deal with these questions. So one of these ways, I'm just going to touch on the ways that people have done this before, but I'm basically going to focus on mourning art. Memorial art primarily focuses on memorializing the dead through a monument or a gravestone or a plaque. Of course, you think of cemeteries. Just since we're local, the top grave is from Woodland Cemetery. The bottom one on this side is from Friends Cemetery in Germantown. And the one on the end is from Mount Moriah Cemetery, which is an abandoned cemetery. Part of why I'm showing you these is to think about the impermanence of these monuments. They wither just like we do with time, and that has a beauty of its own. Mourning art and craft in the past. So you probably have heard, or you may have heard, that the Victorians had a whole slew of things they did to commemorate their dead and to process their grief. What really interests me in that is this is Edward Munch. I believe you can see this in the PMA, but I'm not 100% sure. This is the dead mother. And he was one of those artists that used his art making to process his grief. And death comes up in his work a lot. Oops. So I've gone into here a little bit. I'll come back to the art and craft, but this is the art bit of the talk in the past. These artists that I have selected here have used their work to process a significant death. Gustave Doré, which you may have seen illustrations of The Raven by him, or perhaps Milton's Paradise Lost, or Dante's Divine Comedy, definitely used art making to process the death of his very, very beloved mother, who he lived with till the end of her life. Other ways to process art making, to process grief, is through crafting, and a lot of the time that is women's work. This is the more famous graveyard quilt that was made by the single woman and her daughters, and features deaths in the family and the community. Little tiny coffins with pieces of paper that have inscriptions of the people that passed. Another way to do this is embroidery. This is actually from a young girl, and this is embroidered by a young girl, which is really amazing. I couldn't do that. To process the death of her father. And here's another one. This recently sold at Christie's for $10,000 or something like that, for whoever is keeping track of that. And I love it. It's kind of primitive in its technique, but it's definitely heartfelt. Another way, and probably my favorite way of art making and craft work for grief, is hair work. I have actually a piece with me, if anyone wants to come up later and see it, from the 1800s, late 1800s. So the gist of it is that your loved one died, and you cut off his or her hair, long enough piece that you could work with, and then you braided it, or you made it into little beautiful feather shapes, or you made a wreath out of it. And there was an industry for this in the Victorian times. This was big in Europe, and it was big here. The piece I have is from Philadelphia. And of course, along with that, there was an instruction manual. And I love this, the writer who's showing you how to set up your table to create some very intricate designs. These are some of the pieces he instructs you to create. Now, the fascinating thing about this is the repetitive and very detail-oriented nature of the work. If you're grieving, doing something with your hands, doing something tedious in a way, but creative, can be very healing. And there is evidence of that from neurology, neuroscience, of repetitive actions helping you process trauma. So there was something to it. Oops, sorry. Some pieces. The top one is engraved and painted with enamel. The ones on the bottom and side are all done by hair, very, very carefully placed hair. And if you have the time, there's actually an exhibit of mourning jewelry like these at Freeman's, and it's amazing, and I haven't set foot there because I have no money. Not this kind of money anyway, but they are incredible to see. They're tiny. These are small brooches. Here's a hair wreath. An exhibition at the Mutter Museum is actually going to feature a whole bunch of hair work, so you have to go there. I think they're opening in January. The little feather shapes, when you have a man's hair to work with, it can be hard to braid something, so you resign yourself to making little feather shapes and curlicues. And another mourning hair wreath. This was recently an exhibit in Ben Salem, PA. And on the side is this really kind of unsettling doll. It's made out of wax and is to commemorate a recently deceased infant. Presumably the infant itself would be buried, obviously, I hope. I mean, unless you work in the Mutter Museum, let's not go there. But this was a way for people to pay their respects in a way that didn't involve having the body out there. Part of the reason for that is, of course, the composition. And another reason, it might be just too hard for the parents to be in that presence. Now we're moving on to contemporary mourning art. This is part of the Thanatography project that I've been working on, which is a collection and a showcase of contemporary and modern mourning art and craft. This is the work of Philadelphia artist Kate Terry. Oops. This gives you an idea of the artists I have. Most of them are local, and they all go through a submission process that is fairly subjective, but basically the idea is, have you done artwork in direct response to death, to a significant loss in your life? I'm not really accepting pieces that are metaphorical loss, even though that's perfectly as, or that can be as painful as a death. But I just want to focus on death. This is the piece by a good friend of mine. It's charcoal dust in a bathtub. She did it after her father's death. You may have heard of Caitlin McCormick. She is also local, and she creates these beautiful, intricate crocheted figures, sculptural figures. They're often of animal skeletons, though recently she created some human anatomy-based pieces. And she submitted this piece because she learned crocheting from her grandmother. And after her grandmother passed away, she inherited her grandmother's thread and tools for crocheting, and she proceeded to create this piece to process what she felt about someone she was very, very close to. And that spun her whole body of work. This is Karen Drexel. I include little interviews with the artists or their prose that addresses how and why they created the pieces they created. Karen has a long history of doing self-portraits. So she takes images of herself in different states of mind, and this had to do with suffering a whole series of losses, one after the other. So in a way, her survival of that is what she's addressing, at least partially. Rebecca Reeves, also a local artist. Rebecca collects miniatures that represent items in her family home. And then she obsessively cocoons them. She uses thread that's usually reminiscent of hair, and drawing from that tradition, she creates little keepsakes that are obscured, but also presented in a precious way. I have a piece by Rebecca with me. It's very small. If you can come up and see it. There are some more pieces by her. Rebecca recently lost her father, and she is working on a new submission of the work that she did after she lost her father. I'm eternally grateful to these artists for trusting me with this kind of work, because it's the most personal you can imagine, and I know it means a lot to them, and I hope it means a lot to people that are reading the website and are being exposed to this, and maybe can take away ideas about their own work if they need to. This is my piece, part of why I'm, well, death obsessed or dedicated, D-E-A, yeah, you get the idea, is because I suffered a great loss when I was 20. I lost my partner in a car accident, and that just shaped my whole life. I'm 34 now, so I'm still doing work to process that loss and other losses in my life. But most of my creative work kind of became really, really driven after that. This is a piece that commemorates my cat, who was adorable. She died of a thrombosis, and while I was trying to get her to the vet, she scratched me a lot, so I took pictures of my hands afterwards. Lovely creature. I miss her. But this really helped, just to have that record of something painful and to try to create something beautiful out of it. This is the work of Becky Young. Becky Young is also a local artist. She was the director of photography at Penn for a number of years. And she's my good friend and personal mentor. And most of Becky's work was created after she lost her twin sister. And she's still creating work because of that event in her life. She created these beautiful mandalas, mixture of collage and painting, addressing that loss. This features her sisters. They created masks, plaster masks, and that kind of speaks to the tradition of the death mask. One way to commemorate the dead was to create a plaster mask after they passed. There is a death mask of Lincoln, for example. Back to Kate Terry, again, a local artist. She is addressing here the deaths of her grandmothers by creating these very, very intricate lace-like gloves out of cut paper and embroidery. So when David Bowie died, a lot of people created work to commemorate him. And even though that's not a personal loss in the strict sense of the word, a lot of us were affected by that, especially in my generation older. So these are pieces from a Swedish artist and a collective from the UK, created in direct response to his death. Public mourning is a whole other set of complicated emotions, but it still affects us. And Robert Kreise created these really beautiful tiny miniature paintings of Victorian-inspired women in mourning wear. Paul Romano, another Philadelphia artist, painting. And I'm showing you these to show you the work of the next artist, because hair art, again, these are beautiful weaved pieces about this big. And this artist creates reminiscent work of that using hair and lacquer, and that he cuts it in really intricate shapes, and that creates these geometric structures. And if you, I think from where you are, you can probably see kind of the portrait, the figure created in the larger piece. An artist from Iran. These are artists that I would like to have in thanatography. And I will probably be bugging them soon. An idea of absence in this case. Pascal Lasserre, you may have seen his work. He does a lot of Memento Mori inspired work. This is wood carving. Louis Saxton from Australia, again, creating these wreath-like composite pieces of skulls. Pierre Dreher is known for painting skulls. He recently had this beautiful exhibit in New York. And all these tiny little skulls are individual. So, I'm going to end this and open it to questions. But before I do that, please imagine that there are cups of coffee in this. But you can accept death with any kind of beverage. I want to give you a little gift. This is an online course from Yale, Philosophy and Death. Scan it with your QR app, and you'll get like a whole semester worth of material. If you cannot scan it right now, just write down PHL 176, death, and Google it on, on Google. Also say Yale, that might help. I'm gonna leave this for a minute and answer questions.